Somewhere in the executive lot at Ford's headquarters in Dearborn sits a car Ford has no legal right to sell in the United States. It isn't a prototype gathering dust in a design studio. It's a fully production Xiaomi SU7, an electric sedan from a company that, until a few years ago, was known almost entirely for smartphones. And it's the car Ford's own CEO, Jim Farley, drives to the office most mornings. He didn't buy it from a dealer, obviously. His team went looking for the strongest EVs coming out of China, shipped one from Shanghai to Chicago, and had engineers in a Michigan facility take it apart down to the last fastener. One unit never went back together. Farley kept it for himself, and he's since admitted, on the record, that he's grown attached enough that he doesn't want to part with it. Later, after a research trip through China, he said something almost no head of a legacy American car company says about a foreign rival, that the trip was the most humbling experience of his career, and that Chinese competitors are simply ahead in software, in manufacturing cost, in build quality. Ford is not an outlier in this. Right now, in labs and boardrooms scattered across the US and Europe, engineering teams are running versions of the same exercise, quietly studying, dismantling, and rebuilding themselves around a car company that didn't produce its first vehicle until 2003. That company is BYD, based in Shenzhen, and it has become the reference point for how much of the global auto industry now thinks about batteries, factories, supply chains, and the basic architecture of a car. Nobody in a boardroom wants to use the word copying. But strip away the careful language, and that's exactly what's happening. Where BYD's edge actually comes from, BYD didn't start as a car company. It started in 1995 as a battery manufacturer in Shenzhen, supplying rechargeable cells to phone makers like Motorola and Nokia. By the time it bought a struggling state-owned automaker in 2003, it had already spent 8 years mastering battery production at industrial scale, which means BYD didn't back into batteries after it started building cars. Cars came after. That sequencing shows up in the numbers. In a modern EV, the battery pack alone can account for close to 40% of the total cost of the vehicle, not a line item, but nearly half the machine. Whoever owns that piece effectively owns the economics of the whole car. BYD's answer to that is the blade battery, which combines two separate ideas. The first is chemistry, lithium iron phosphate, or LFP, which avoids nickel and cobalt, uses cheaper raw inputs, and is markedly more resistant to fire than the alternatives. The second is structure. Rather than grouping cells into modules and then into a pack, the conventional approach, BYD slots long, flat cells directly into the pack itself, cutting out an entire layer of hardware and wasted space. On top of that, BYD reached backward into the supply chain and took stakes in lithium mining operations in Chile and parts of Africa. From the raw mineral to the finished vehicle, one company controls nearly the whole chain. Watching the West copy it, one plant at a time, now look at what Ford, Volkswagen, and Porsche are actually doing, and the resemblance is hard to miss. Ford is building Blue Oval Battery Park in Marshall, Michigan, to produce LFP cells domestically using licensed technology, and Farley has openly named BYD as one of the companies Ford studied while redesigning its supply chain. Across the Atlantic, Volkswagen and Porsche are moving toward the same combination: more battery production brought in-house, a shift to LFP chemistry, and cell-to-pack assembly replacing the old modular design. Batteries turn out to be the opening move, not the whole game. Once a company starts asking why it doesn't build its own cells, the next question is why it doesn't build its own motors, then its own chips, then its own software stack. BYD doesn't stop at batteries. It designs its own semiconductors in an industry where most rivals buy chips from outside vendors. It builds its own motors and power electronics. When the global chip shortage hit in 2021 and froze assembly lines everywhere, BYD's own chip plants kept running, and BYD kept shipping cars while competitors idled. As one industry executive put it, competing with BYD isn't really about building a better car anymore. It's about competing with an entire self-contained industrial system, from raw material to finished vehicle. That's a direct challenge to the model Western manufacturers spent roughly 4 decades perfecting. Specialize in what you're good at and buy everything else: chips, electronics, software, cells, from a global network of outside suppliers. It was capital efficient, and for a long stretch, it was the obviously correct strategy. It just rested on a quiet assumption that the parts you don't make yourself will always be available at a price you can plan around. The last several years, the chip shortage, shipping costs spiking, tariffs, port congestion, broke that assumption badly enough that the companies which had kept production in-house suddenly looked like the smart ones. So the reversal is now visible in real plans, not just talking points. Ford's next affordable EV program is being built around owning its software stack outright, so updates can be pushed over the air and individual hardware components can serve multiple functions, an approach that's far closer to Shenzhen than to Detroit's traditional playbook. Volkswagen, for its part, is being told internally that its long-term survival depends on bringing battery and drivetrain production back in-house. There's a limit, though, to how fast any of this can actually be copied. A teardown can be purchased. Engineers can be hired away. A battery plant can be built. What can't be bought is 2 decades of growing as a single integrated organization, the way BYD's car business grew directly out of its battery business, rather than being bolted on afterward. Ford and Volkswagen are now trying to graft that same integration onto century-old organizations that were built around the opposite philosophy. And history has already run this experiment once. 100 years ago, Henry Ford tried to control his entire supply chain by growing his own rubber in the Amazon, in a settlement called Fordlandia. It collapsed. Total vertical control looks brilliant during a shortage and has a long track record of becoming a liability once conditions normalize. The unglamorous part: fewer models, brutal discipline. Then there's the piece of the playbook that never makes it into a press release: platform discipline. BYD builds a wide range of vehicles off a small number of shared architectures, reusing components across models instead of engineering each one from scratch. It's not a flashy insight, but analysts point to it as one of the main reasons both BYD and Tesla can sell in huge volumes and still turn a real profit. For a legacy automaker, adopting that discipline is genuinely painful. It means discontinuing models, trimming lineups, and building a narrower range of vehicles more cheaply and more efficiently. Ford's version of this is the $5 billion Universal EV platform, announced in August 2025, a new architecture meant to underpin an entire family of lower-cost vehicles, starting with a mid-size electric pickup targeted at roughly $30,000, to be built in Louisville, Kentucky, and launched in 2027. It's expected to use a structural LFP battery, hit 0 to 60 in about 4.5 seconds, and run meaningfully more efficiently than any EV Ford has built before. Farley has compared the moment to the original Model T and has said plainly that the team was assembled with BYD as the benchmark. To build it, Ford set up a skunkworks operation in California, staffed with engineers pulled from Tesla, aerospace and defense, led by a 12-year Tesla veteran whose job is to strip cost and weight out of the vehicle, down to the gram. The kind of relentless cost discipline that's long been a hallmark of Chinese manufacturing, now running out of a lab in California. In Europe, the cost of this shift shows up in headcount rather than in press releases. Volkswagen is in the middle of cutting 50,000 jobs in Germany by 2030, and in July 2026, CEO Oliver Blume told staff that as many as 50,000 additional positions could be at risk to keep the company competitive. One advisor connected to BYD described Volkswagen's situation as a wake-up call for the entire European industry, a blunt way of saying that catching up isn't a strategy slide, it's tens of thousands of jobs and years of restructuring. Why no one will say the word copying. Given how visible all of this is, the obvious question is why executives keep dancing around it. The answer is that they're stuck holding 2 opposing positions at once. On one side, genuine respect. Farley has called BYD the best in the business on cost and manufacturing. On the other, open alarm. The same executives describe the Chinese auto sector as an existential threat, and Chinese-made EVs are currently kept out of the U.S. market by a 100% tariff. That tension is why the public language stays vague, learning from, inspired by, even when the underlying activity is a company taking apart a rival's product to build its own version of it. When reverse engineering feels too slow, some companies are skipping it entirely and bringing Chinese manufacturing directly onto their own factory floors. Stellantis, parent of Jeep, Fiat, Peugeot and Ram, didn't just study Chinese EV maker Leapmotor from a distance. It took an equity stake in the company. In May 2026, the two confirmed that Leapmotor vehicles will be assembled at Stellantis' plant in Figueruelas, Spain, near Zaragoza, starting in the second half of 2026, beginning with the B10 compact SUV, with plans to eventually co-develop an Opel electric SUV together. That's a major Western manufacturer building a Chinese company's cars, under a shared badge, on European soil. It doesn't stop there. In Barcelona, inside a factory Nissan walked away from, Chinese automaker Chery has partnered with local company Ebro EV Motors to produce Ebro-branded vehicles, with a stated goal of reaching 150,000 units a year at that site. Meanwhile, BYD is building its own European base directly, a €4 billion plant in Szeged, Hungary, which has started trial production and is aiming for full-scale output in 2026, with eventual capacity of up to 300,000 vehicles annually. The market data already reflects the shift. Chinese brands took a record 10.9% share of Europe's new car market in June 2026, with sales up 118% year-over-year, and registered 663,000 vehicles across the first half of 2026, double the figure from the year before. Even Ford flirted with this approach. Early in 2026, reports surfaced that Ford had held talks with Xiaomi about a possible joint venture that could help bring Chinese manufacturing into the U.S. Both companies denied it. But the fact that the rumor was even plausible says something on its own. A decade ago, a Detroit automaker partnering with a Chinese phone company to build cars would have sounded absurd. Now it barely raises an eyebrow. What's actually being replaced? Pull back far enough, and this stops being a story about Ford, or Volkswagen, or even BYD specifically. For roughly 40 years, the Western auto industry ran on a simple bet: specialize in what you do best, buy the rest from the market, and trust that the market will keep delivering. That assumption held up for decades, long enough that people stopped noticing it was a choice rather than a law of nature. What's happening now is that bet quietly being unwound. Piece by piece, Western manufacturers are moving away from specialize and outsource, and back toward own the whole thing. From the lithium in the ground to the code running the dashboard. That's not a minor strategic adjustment. It's an admission that the old rulebook stopped working, and that the company which wrote the new one is sitting in Shenzhen. No executive wants to say that part out loud, because saying it means admitting the old approach was wrong for a very long time. But the evidence doesn't need anyone's confirmation. It's sitting in the battery plants, the restructuring announcements, and the layoff memos. The industry has already made its decision about who's ahead. It's just choosing to show that answer in its balance sheets instead of its press conferences. So here's the question worth sitting with. Is following BYD's playbook the smartest move Western automakers have left, the start of a real comeback? Or is it, in effect, an admission that the race is already over, dressed up as a strategy?